Max, how did Greece get here?
Well, this is an example of what you could call piñata capitalism. Before the crisis, the Greek economy was roughly $400 billion, but there are many hedge funds in the world that have access to instruments and leverage of $600, $700, $800 billion, much bigger than the country itself, and they decided to attack it using these leveraged instruments in a piñata capitalistic way to try to grab assets on the cheap. It's a high-stakes game. There's a lot of risk involved, but bankers are making more money than ever in the history of banking, and they will continue to do so as long as nobody gets in their way, like a regulator or a politician.
You talked about regulations. There need to be more regulations. Can you expand on that? What needs to happen exactly?
Well, there needs to be enforcement of regulations. There are regulations in place, but none of the banks obey the rules. They don't obey the regulations, and there's nobody really enforcing the regulations. So this is a problem. It's called moral hazard. If you can get away with, as Goldman Sachs did, by cooking the books of Greece to join the euro and taking $300 million in fees to commit that fraud, and there's no penalty, then there's no reason for you not to continue to commit these frauds as they're doing today, along with those other banks mentioned, like J.P. Morgan. So we need some enforcement of the regulations that are on the books, but unfortunately the regulators are in the pockets of the politicians. In the United States, Barack Obama is supported by Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan. In the UK, David Cameron is supported by HSBC, Barclays, and the City of London and the speculators. And in the European zone, we have the same thing happening in European banks who are controlling the bankers as well. But I would like to add that as bad as the situation in Greece looks, I would still like to point out that the U.S. dollar is in a lot worse shape and is really going to suffer catastrophically before the euro does. The euro is still, relative to the dollar, in pretty good shape.
You know, the problem is not regulation. Max, I beg to differ with you. If you're going to suggest that Goldman Sachs is smarter than the country of Greece, fine. But, you know, this problem, you've got the same problems erupting all over. You've got it in Spain. You've got it in Italy. You had it in Ireland. It's a systemic problem. It's not a banking problem, and it's not a fraud problem. It's very simply this. Years of government, big government spending finally caught up because the economic growth could not support it. It's very simple. It's a matter of spending more than you take in, more than your economy can produce, more than your economy can support in a reasonable tax base. You know, capitalism, Winston Churchill once had a great saying. He said, it's a terrible system, but it's the best one we have, and it really is. Every other system we've tried of economic planning, central planning, and socialism and communism have failed miserably.
Okay, what about that, Max? The capitalist system is the best one that we can have?
Well, I would differ with the thought that the banks are not the root of the problem. Yes, it's true, it's a global problem. Greece is not a one-off. We're seeing the problem in every country in the world, because the globe's central banks now are in possession of $15 trillion of toxic debts, according to the Wall Street Journal, as a result of the inability to perform as viable, legitimate banking institutions that should have gotten a handle on this many years ago. But because they are essentially corrupt and unregulated and committing acts of larceny, and we have this global problem, which is created by global banks, perpetrated by global banks for the profit of the bankers. And this is not in question. Everyone understands this, from the Financial Times, The Economist, William Black, the regulator in the United States who put 1,500 bankers in jail in the 1980s. Nobody disputes this. Anyone who still thinks that bankers are not the problem are on the payroll of a bank or just completely uninformed. The epicenter of the global financial fraud is, first of all, the City of London. Because of the revelations of the recent hypothecation and rehypothecation scandal of the MF Global, which incidentally had J.P. Morgan, a banker, steal customer accounts directly from customers in segregated accounts, that's a crime. And they don't say that they didn't commit a crime. They simply said that we're too big to fail and you can't prosecute us. AIG, the Bernie Madoff scandal, all went through the City of London because there's virtually no regulation in the City of London. This is the epicenter of the global banking fraud market. Second to that would be the United States, with Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke, working with JP Morgan, who has a balance sheet of $60 to $70 trillion in derivatives. They have, JP Morgan, one bank, has 4 times the entire GDP of America as off-balance sheet derivatives contracts that they park at the Fed, and they do a little swap back and forth every quarter to massage and manipulate their earnings. Highly fraudulent. Again, illegal by all the standard accounting rules, committing acts of fraud. And they pay penalties. JP Morgan has paid billions in penalties for accounting fraud. They say, we won't do it again. We promise we won't commit fraud again, but you can't attack us because we're too big to fail. And then they commit the same fraud the next quarter. So unless somebody stands up and regulates Jamie Dimon, who is a financial criminal in a court, and he's causing things like Greece to collapse, his and his cadre, and people are suffering. So he's a human rights abuser. I would take him to The Hague, put him on trial for human rights violations, and hang him, because he's a terrorist in the banking world, as Warren Buffett calls them, weapons of mass financial destruction. That's not just a rhetorical statement. That's a statement of fact.
Well, Max, you're very passionate, and I think you truly believe what you're saying. I look at it a little differently. That is not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is not that the banking system is underregulated. It's massively overregulated to a too big to fail status. Do you realize in 2007, the most heavily regulated industry, not only in the United States, but in the world, was the banking system, and it failed. The United States and Europe, then they compounded the mistake by bailing them out. That was the big mistake in creating bigger banks that could not fail. I agree with you, Max. That is a problem. But the problem is it's from overregulation and overcoddling and from bailing out. If you look at a history of the banking system in the United States, all the way up through the 1990s, banking system was sound and it was solid. It's then when increased regulation started coming through, increased meddling by Congress in housing markets and so forth, that all the financial problems have started.
Okay, Mr. Moore, you have, let me get some reactions, because you have major reactions coming out of Paris and London on your statements.
Okay.
Max, you first. Why are you laughing? Why are you yawning?
Because this is just claptrap coming out of Washington, trying to defend the actions of an obvious scandal, banking scandal. And it doesn't play well outside of the United States. Unfortunately, people who live in the bubble that is the United States buy into this nonsense. And the bankers on Wall Street are still walking around without being incarcerated for a few more weeks. But their day will come. And we're seeing social unrest all over the world, and it's coming to the United States. So I wouldn't want to be Jamie Dimon and walking around without a full security detail.
My only comment is this. Why is it we only see the rallies in the countries that are not full democracies? Where are the full democracies rallying?
Max?
In America? You have massive rallies. You have massive.
Okay.
You had almost a coup in Wisconsin.
Okay.
You've got rallies all over the United States. The people are rallying all over the United States because they're being disenfranchised. There's poverty rates are skyrocketing. Incarceration rates are the highest in the world. America excels at the prison industry business. That's about the best thing that they're involved with. The banks are involved in outright criminality. There are solutions, but you're never going to accept them because you're intellectual pygmies over there without the spine to put criminals in jail.